Order, order. I call to order the Defence Committee's last hearing on the Armed Forces Covenant, and very, very grateful to those fine individuals giving evidence today, in particular Minister Alistair Carns, the Minister for Veterans and People. We also have with us Vice Admiral Philip Haley, the Chief of Defence People at the Ministry of Defence. We also have here Sarah Houghton, the Director of Armed Forces People Policy at the Ministry of Defence, and Mr. James Greenrod, the Head of Armed Forces People Support at the Ministry of Defence. Before we begin our questioning, I believe, Minister, you wanted to set the scene with a brief introduction about your work with regards to the Armed Forces Covenant. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tan. I think it's really important as we look at the Covenant, we don't just narrow in on it, but we step back and look holistically at the geopolitical situation. And as we've seen North Korean troops into Ukraine, we've got issues in Southeast Asia, you've got Middle East, Gaza, etc. But you've got the Ukrainian conflict, which is causing a significant amount of casualties on both sides of the line, 2,000 on average a day, which in some cases is incomprehensible. So why is that important? Because if we look into society at the moment, the UK nation as a whole, we do see a societal and defence drift of where if I was to go to the panel today and say your father, your grandfather, your grandmother, etc., probably will have a connection with defence, may have served. But that's becoming less and less so as our armed forces get smaller and society perhaps isn't necessarily as involved in defence as it once was. That's why the Covenant is so important, because we don't ask anybody else in the public sector to put their life and limb on the line for service. No other public sort of organisation has no recourse to disobey orders or has a union. And it's so very unique being in the armed forces. And creating a legal duty to ensure no one is disadvantaged is absolutely essential, not only to be understood in society and at the local government level, but also at the cross-government level, something perhaps we can pick up on in a second. And so in a societal approach to understanding and helping those that serve, those that have served and their families, needs to be far more inculcated between society and defence as we move forward in this really fractious geopolitical situation that we live in. And that's why I think this panel today and this discussion is so important.
Good. Thank you very much, Minister, for setting the scene there. Right, straight over to Derek Twigg.
Can I ask you what are the shortcomings in the Covenant, and what particularly has prompted you to want to change the law, to update the law?
I think a really important question. In now for 8 almost 9 months, travelled the country, travelled to devolved administrations, and it's been really clear to me that dependent on where you go is dependent on the level of services or adherence to what we would see as the Covenant, and indeed the understanding of it. And I often describe it a little bit like a postcode lottery on the level of services, because there's no uniformity in it. And in some cases that's right, because of the nuances of the different cultures you'll go to, whether that be Scotland, Northern Ireland, northwest to southeast. But on the same hand, there's very little adherence or understanding of the Covenant that is standardised across the country. And I think bringing the Covenant into the legal duty and the due regard into other government departments' psyche, making sure that they have to acknowledge it, will absolutely provide an element of standardisation and better services for those in service. Does anyone else would like to comment on that?
Thank you very much, Minister. So I think just really to build on what the Minister has said, in my experience, the issue isn't one that other departments or local authorities, or whoever it may be, is sort of apathetic or doesn't want to help. It's that they don't necessarily understand what it is that they need to do, and part of that is, with all of the other priorities, it's just not something that they've necessarily focused on. Now, I can give some absolutely outstanding examples of where they have, but I think sort of in the round, what we recognise is that broadening sort of the duty of due regard will actually, in terms of raising awareness, raising understanding of the sorts of challenges that can face the armed forces community will help us in our conversations across government and at the local and regional level to really unpick some of those knottier issues.
So just, unless I misunderstand you, what you're basically saying is that we have the Covenant, but actually a lot of people have just ignored it for whatever reason, and what you're going to do is actually make them not ignore it and implement it. Is that what you're basically saying?
I think, Derek, that's exactly the case.
Yeah.
I don't think they actively ignore it. I don't think there's any nefariousness there. I think there hasn't been an imperative to understand it because defence may not have been high up in the priority ladder. And secondly, no one's taken time out to educate or communicate, whether it be the local authority or indeed even the cross-government departments here up in Whitehall, as to what the Covenant actually means and what it stands for. And that's primarily around the two principles, that no one serving in the armed forces should face a disadvantage, and obviously special consideration to those that perhaps in some cases need it most. The legal duty and the due regard within the Covenant will make sure people will have to consider that in other government departments when they go through with their policy decisions or legal action.
And I wonder if it's just worth as well just clarifying that the duty is already embedded in legislation. It covers local authorities and the NHS and schools at the moment. So what we're doing is just extending it to other government departments as well and the devolved administration. So it's just creating that framework to ensure that there is wider awareness and there is this sort of legal obligation that those organisations have to have due regard to, bearing in mind when they're developing their policies, bearing in mind the armed forces community.
Basically what you're saying is that they just haven't been implementing it.
If I may, I think so. I can point to Department for Health and Social Care and the NHS who've embedded the Covenant in their constitution and have introduced things like sort of Op Courage, Op Nova, really good examples. And I think what this enables us to do is to have DWP have got armed forces champions in their job centre areas. I think what this enables us to do is broaden that conversation out to other government departments and for areas that might not realise the role that they can play in helping us implement the Covenant.
So if we then put this, you change the law, and what if they then don't do it?
I think
what's the sanctions that are going to be put in place?
So what I would argue is at the moment it's really narrow. We're going to broaden it out to include other government departments.
Yes,
I've been really clear on that one, a maximalist approach. They will have to consider the Covenant when they are pushing through policy or.
Well, my question is, what if they don't?
Well, the point being
don't do it to the extent that
so
is
if they
intended.
don't, there is to the far right, which would obviously be a JR or judicial review. But the reality is, what we need to do within defence is make sure there is a mechanism in place, I think, at the local level, to ensure that local councils adhere to and consider the Covenant when implementing policy and decisions. And so I think we've got to be on us to police that.
It needs a whole government approach, and it means a buy-in from the whole from the cabinet down.
It's the reason,
and that's not happened so far.
It's the reason we're going a maximalist approach.
Yeah. Okay, Chair.
Thank you. Lincoln Job?
Yeah, Minister, thank you. I'd like to pick up on a couple of words in your opening remarks, societal drift and the principle of no one is disadvantaged, by quoting from a letter produced recently by the SAS Association. Hundreds are ensnared in legacy processes, in many cases facing more years of uncertainty and stress after decades of the same. With seemingly endless avenues for legal appeal and continual changes in government policy on how the legacy of the troubles should be dealt with, it is unsurprising that veterans feel unjustly hounded for doing their duty. UKSF veterans feel they alone face criminal investigation and risk prosecution for doing what they were trained, authorised and expected to do as part of a successful counter-terrorist campaign. So our veterans are actually under attack. It's not just suffering disadvantage. You are the Veterans Minister. Do you think you're doing enough to defend our veterans and fulfil your obligations under the military covenant?
So I think we are doing the best we can, and we are working hard to do even more. And that's why we're sat here today saying that the covenant, which is really narrow at the moment, is going to be broadened out to include far more of the cross-government architecture to ensure not just our veterans but all armed forces personnel are protected. On that specific issue, on that letter, you may have seen my reply. You may not have, but on the same hand, you'll meet very few other people that have the same experience of some of the stuff you've just talked about, that understands the nuance of combat, the stress of some of the situations that in particular that letter points to, and therefore you won't find very few, or you'll find very few individuals who are committed to fighting and ensuring that veterans get what the support they require as we move forward through what is a really complicated process. Myself and the NIO have met several times to discuss these issues, and probably on a weekly basis. I was over in Northern Ireland last week speaking to all of the veterans, whether that be from PSNI all the way through to some of the formalised military units, to make sure their views and any issues they have are represented correctly at the right level and championed by me.
So do you think the extension of the Armed Forces Covenant is the vehicle by which you will eventually protect them, or is it going to be something else?
I think it's a combination, a multifaceted approach to ensure veterans and armed forces community is represented really well. This is one angle which I think is broadening out much more, and part of that is about an education communication programme to ensure that cross-government, all the way down to the local level, understand the nuances of being in the armed forces and therefore ensure that they aren't disadvantaged in later life. And that then ties into some of the veterans issues you've just talked through, to ensure that nobody is disadvantaged because of their military service.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Minister, obviously you have a distinguished service to the nation yourself, but I think from some of the evidence that we have received, it is apparent that you definitely have your work cut out, because, I mean, one particular individual who gave evidence said, the Armed Forces Covenant doesn't seem to affect me at all. In his words, it's a gimmick that has no real substance. Another person who said, in practice, it means nothing at all because of their inability to access dental services. Another one on healthcare services. So there are so many gaps. Would you concede that there is a lot that needs to be done cross-departmentally in order to give the level of service that our brave servicemen and women deserve?
100%. Some of the issues you're talking about there are particularly for veterans. Here's a rough statistic for you. In the Canadian Veterans Service, there's 3,500 people employed to look after veterans. How many do we have in the UK? In the OVA, the Office of Veterans Affairs, we have just under 70. We have 2 million veterans. The Canadians have 500,000. So I would argue that for a long time the government hasn't taken responsibility in any way, shape or form to the extent required to look after its veteran population. It's actually disaggregated that and delegated it to the third sector. Hence the reason we see 1,750 odd charities in the supporting the armed forces community, full of amazing and absolutely outstanding people. But the coordination and the coherence of the support across £1 billion industry could be improved. And one of the ways you improve it is by the government taking more responsibility for how it supports its veterans network in particular, and the armed forces through the Covenant, and we need to take that on. So I would argue, I absolutely 100% agree that we need to do a lot more, and we need to do a lot more fast. In comparison to other nations, we're not doing it properly.
Agreed. I want to move now on from the current working of the Covenant onto the government's legislative plans. And I'd like to invite Emily Buck, please.
Thanks, Chair. Afternoon, everyone. Minister, when I'd asked Minister Pollard in the Chamber about our last committee's recommendations from the Atherton Review and those from the Lyons Review to have serious cases heard in civilian, not military courts, the Minister said that the Armed Forces Bill would be an opportunity to get that right. Since then, we've had the awful tragic death of Jaisley Beck, which has shown once again that the chain of command can't and should not be policing itself, and that it should be removed from all sexual misconduct cases. So will those recommendations be in the Armed Forces Bill?
Well, we got to be. So when I came into this job, one of the first places I visited was a serious and organised, the Serious Crime Unit, and indeed the Victim and Witness Care Unit, which is based down south. The reason I went to look at that because I wanted to review whether the military as a whole was capable of looking and investigating some of the most serious crimes that we come across. Just to be really clear, any victim that comes out of the military with one of these issues has a choice. And they can either go through the service justice system or the criminal justice system. So they have that choice and available now. it would be very remiss of us to restrict that choice. It is up to them. And if they obviously come through the military channel, they will get a whole suite of support that is provided. And actually, from what I've seen, it's working in a very professional and effective way. Remember that the Gunnerbeck issue, which is absolutely tragic, took place in 2021. There's been quite a lot of recommendations come into place. We're still got a long way to go. And you know, when I joined in 98, the military had a long way to go then. We've still got, it's a bit like an oil tanker, it takes a long time to change. We're trying to push that as hard and fast as we possibly can. The serious organised crime unit that we have, the witness support unit, the victim support unit is I think, top of the class. And actually we've invited people from the criminal justice system to come down and see how we're doing business. Does anyone want to add anything?
So, Minister, I would add that I think everyone in the service was utterly shocked, and all three services, to read and hear of the coroner's outcome to the inquest into Gunnerbeck. It was an absolutely terrible circumstances. She was badly let down. And what I can say is that the Defence Serious Crime Command are actively looking into investigative evaluations of everything relating to that case right now. And I don't want to say anything more than that because obviously that's a policing matter, which I wouldn't want to comment any further on. But what I would want to say is that I would just reiterate the point that we're also looking widely at all the other cases that have been widely communicated in social media, on some prominent websites. There has not been a significant increase in reported cases as a result of that. But again, the Serious Crimes Unit are pursuing active lines of inquiry into all those social media statements. And I would reiterate the point that anybody who is a victim of any crime, whether they wish to report the crime, to have the crime investigated, or whether they just want support to the Victim Witness Crime Unit, they should contact either the civilian police or the Victim Witness Care Unit and Serious Crimes Command on a confidential hotline that's available 24/7, which is on 0800 085 0658. And it's a victim-led approach that we follow now. If a victim just wishes support, then he or she can just have support. If the victim just wishes to understand what other opportunities are open to them and what a formal process might look like, what it would mean for them, and they want to talk through the whole process before they even start, then that advice is available for them. And should they decide to take it further, then the Victim Witness Care Unit is by their side all the way through. And that level of service that we are now providing through the Victim Witness Care Unit and the Serious Crimes Command, I think is recognised now to be best in class, and probably at a level which victims would not receive anywhere else.
Is the chain of command no longer the first port of call? Is the chain of command completely removed if someone has a complaint?
Any victim,
of that nature?
Any victim does not need to talk to anyone in their chain of command if they wish to report an incident. They can either go to the civilian police, or they can go to the Victim Witness Care Unit or the Serious Crimes Command within the Ministry of Defence Crime Command, which is entirely separate to the Army, the Navy and the Air Force's chains of command. And
that was one of the recommendations after the Gunnerbeck case in 2021, where we pulled it out of the single services to make it independent so people didn't feel like they were hemmed in by those single services.
So still though, this committee does a regular refresh of the Atherton review, and we're still getting reports about cultural problems in the forces. And you yourself, Minister, said after Jaisley Beck that the government stepped up efforts to bring about crucial reform. What are those reforms then that you're stepping up?
Starting the question, the Atherton review is obviously around the LGBT community. The financial redress scheme is now in place.
Atherton, not Atherton.
Atherton, okay, got it.
My accent.
So we've moved a long way since 2021. We have still got a long way to go. And I'm not going to stand here and say that defence is as good as it should be. We are moving in the right direction. The Serious Crime Unit, the creation of it was a big lift to pull everything out of the single services, and that gives people the ability to go outside of the chain of command. The Victim and Witness Care Unit, and actually the way cases are dealt with now, from our reports, make it far more acceptable for people to make a complaint in the first place, which actually creates a spike in the radar because people feel comfortable to come forward. So that's heading in the right place. Actually, when I was still serving, we brought out the zero tolerance policy. So there is now zero tolerance when it comes to sexual harassment. But we still have a long way to go on that and making sure it's implemented and there's synergy between all of the different single services. So we're looking into that as well. And just recently, prior to the next HCDC we have next week, we've got a whole raft of recommendations coming through on, I would argue, relatively narrow cultural change programs that are individually irrelevant but collectively could be significant. And so we're packaging them up to try and make a bigger change for defence.
And Minister, you mentioned 2021 as the date when Jaisley Beck's case first began. How many sexual harassment and abuse cases have there been in the forces since 2021?
I think we should probably come back to that with an accurate number.
We've answered lots of PQs and that. We do have the data, so we can get back to you with the stats. I just want to be clear, though. We are doing our best to eradicate any sexual harassment whatsoever. We will never fully eradicate it. We're seeing actually across society, under 16s in particular, a large increase in sexual harassment or sexual incidents because of you get a multifaceted approach, but we're seeing an increase in younger people. So the demographic we're pulling on, we've got to then re-zero or take, balance down some of the social demographic we get to retrain them in line with what we would class our standards, which takes some time. And so we are seeing this sort of bump as they come into the military until we get the standards and sort of levels of rules and regulations around them.
I'd just say I think the general perception out there is that there is a cultural problem. A lot of families who are bereaved think we've heard all this about change and reform before, and yet tragic cases like this still keep happening. So I think there's a lot of work to do. It's not just about changing the structures, it's about changing culture. And it seems to be quite embedded in some areas of our forces. And that links to your original opening comments, Minister, where you said there's less and less people joining up.
Well, agreed. There's actually lots of people wanting to join. It's actually the process of getting them through the door is one of our biggest problems. But yes, I completely agree. I completely agree with the cultural issue, and we are looking into it in detail.
Mr. Can you also just update us on the progress of the government's legislative plan, just in general? Where are we with that? And also, whether the government still plans to use the Armed Forces Bill as the vehicle for this change, and when will that be introduced, please?
So we are thinking of the Armed Forces Bill in 2026, hopefully, early 2026, and that will bring the Covenant legislation into place. Have you got any further detail on that?
No, exactly as you said, Minister.
So definitely early 2026 is when we're expecting that.
Definitely 2026. We'll try and get it early. It depends on the parliamentary timetable.
Right. Okay. Right. Right. Let's move on to the Covenant legal duty. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Minister, for your time today. The Treasury is failing our service families by not considering the impact of service on being an owner-occupier under the stamp duty rules. The DfE fails our service families by not recognising the impact of moves between local authorities and devolved administrations or the EHCP system. The Home Office fails our non-UK service families by imposing immigration status during service that removes access to work or benefits. The NHS is failing our service families routinely in almost every regard, and as we know, I could go on. Minister, you're not responsible for any of these failings, but the plan to extend the Covenant legal duty to central government will not just throw a spotlight upon them, but create potential for a legal challenge. And so I ask, what work is going on in advance of the Armed Forces Act to ensure that all departmental policies are in line with the Covenant from the start, and what work has been done with the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations in this regard?
So thank you very much for the question. I'll allow the specifics to the rest of the team. Much broader, we are in consultation now with cross-government. That consultation is taking place. I've already met with several of the ministers There is a lot of work to go between now and 2026 to work out each one of those government departments, and we're going really broad, and to work out what sits below them when it comes to some of the changes we could put in place that make sure that no armed forces personnel are disadvantaged, or indeed service personnel. That's going to be a raft, because we're going pretty broad. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a raft of changes that sit under each one of those. We may not get them all, but we'll definitely be in a step in the right direction. Does anybody want to?
Thank you, Minister. I think really just to pick up on some of those points. So we are absolutely engaging with other government departments, both as officials and at ministerial level, and we're having conversations about the 4 examples of where we as Defence, recognising the other pressures on those departments, but where we see that there are sort of shortcomings in some of the provision. We are already seeing some movement, and I think that's in part because they've seen the manifesto commitment and they know that this is coming. One of the ones that you mentioned was DFE and sort of the ability to move care plans for children with special educational needs. So they have clarified their guidance on that. But does everybody know that the guidance has been clarified? And I think this is part of the importance and the strength of what the new legislation will enable us to do, because exactly as you said, it will enable us to put a spotlight on that and say the policies have changed in a good way. What we now need to make sure is that both at the national level and the local level, everybody understands what those changes are. And that's why, as part of the work that my team will be doing, so over the course of the next year, we will be working up sort of training materials with other government departments, and looking at some of those specific policy. This is where we actually think a practical and pragmatic change for the better can be made.
What I would say is a lot of the willingness and movement to change will be based on understanding the impact of which you know only too well, as do some of the other board of being in the armed forces. For example, in a 20-year career, your average family will move 7 to 8 times, if not more. That has a whole ripple effect for children's education, for spousal employment, just the bare administration of living and surviving as you bounce around either the country, devolved administrations, or indeed abroad. You're on call, or the individual in service is on call 24/7, which means you also have a problem when it comes to spousal employment, but having that normal life. And so I think some of these, and that's just a very small section of it, making sure people understand the difference between other public service roles and the armed forces, and then why the covenant is so important, is where we really need to get to. And I mentioned earlier on that I do think we're across government we can work that as ministers and policy officials, but down at the local level there is a requirement to ensure that local governments understand that implication as well, especially for those areas that have high density armed forces moving through their region. So I'd like to see how we can educate and communicate that more effectively at the local level.
And as I said, we've been engaging, very widely with other government officials in other government departments and with the local authorities and with the devolved administrations. And there will be statutory guidance available to sort of guide them about the kind of things that they could look at.
But I won't explore any of the areas because I know some of the other members have framed and set out some of the areas that I think should be considered. But do you get a sense then that there is a conscious acceptance that this is going to be coming from the other government departments, and do you also sense that they are prepared to take the burden of the costs? Because there is a danger that we identify areas and that they just drive this back into defence, when actually this is a societal cost that those government departments should be bearing themselves.
Yeah, I think on the whole, everybody is generally supportive with it, and we've been engaging with them. And it's not a new thing for them, it's not a new challenge for MOD, because they've sort of been under the sort of policy constraints right from when the covenant was put in place. So they, all throughout this period, they should have been looking and having a view to the armed forces community. But I think this, this will obviously give them that legal constraints. But yes, I think the funding, clearly it's difficult to anticipate at this stage what the costs will be in actually having this due regard from the duty legislation. And that's something we'll have to work through with them. We need to have sort of flexibility about how they apply it in their particular areas going through. But yes, on the whole, I've been generally supportive.
You mentioned sort of conscious acceptance. Speaking to the ministers, I think a lot of people accept and agree with it. What we need to do now is work with those government departments to work out what sits below that. What actual changes are we going to put in place? And then that's got to obviously balance the cost and of course the need across broader society in conjunction with the need of the armed forces. And there's a balance in all of that, and there's a sweet spot, and that will differ depending on where you are in the country and the demand on local services. But you have sort of my word that we're going to push that really hard across government and try and get the best changes in place for the armed forces, because it underpins the moral component of fighting power, why people want to join the armed forces and why and how they fight.
Thanks. So the last thing I would just thank you for, just to pray on your word about being conscious about your remarks at the beginning and the conscious of exchange of service during wartime, and that exchange to the peace dividend that we've enjoyed for so long, that was enshrined in the welfare system by our Labour government post-war, and the fact that we may have to go through an unconscious doing process to
again, I think that's really important.
I think it's a very important conversation.
It's easy to be conscious when you're at conflict. You remember the height of Afghanistan or Iraq, the armed forces were on the news everywhere, everyone understood it. And then you hit an element of peace, and then, slowly things start to get pulled away perhaps. And then you're called upon again, everything's built back up. What we need to do is accept that must be continuity through the system. And indeed, I go back to the postcode lottery to ensure there's a level of standardisation of the care and support that those serving, those that have served, and indeed their families, who are often forgotten about, get the support they require.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick one, actually, picking up just directly off that point. Do you think there are things that we could learn from other countries in terms of the relationship that their armed forces or their government has with their veterans, but also service personnel? I mean, an obvious example is America, right, where there's all sorts of legislation and support and a very close relationship between that Clausewitzian trinity between the people, state, and forces. So, Minister.
It would hardly be a debate without Clausewitz coming into it, so really well done. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot we can learn off other nations. I mentioned the Canadian Veterans Service, sitting at about 3,500. We've got 60 in the OVA, maybe a couple of hundred in defence, but we're nowhere near that. And so I think there is a government responsibility to deliver more, in particular for our veterans. But also, there's I wouldn't say a cultural reset, but there's a cultural bond back. We've got to bring that societal drift from away to coming back together between defence and society. For example, you go to America, I don't know, all the serving people, people will stop you in the street and say, thank you for your service. They're really proud, and they understand that without your armed forces, without security, you can't have a prosperous economy, you can't have the welfare state, you can't have anything that sits below it. It is the first principle of any government. And so I think we've got to think about that, not just ships, aircraft, guns and bullets, but people, basing, accommodation, the soft functions, access to services. So I absolutely agree that we can learn, and we're doing that now, and a lot of the policy team have been out and about to, whether it be the Canadians, the Australians, who are slightly more similar in size, but also the Americans, to work out where we can pull lessons back. And there are plans afoot to change some of the structures, which over time will help change that culture.
So I think that sounds about right, and lessons and structures. Is there a leadership role that the government can play, particularly government ministers such as yourself, or perhaps MPs, in I don't want to use the word educating the public, but in terms of bringing the importance of these issues to the public, and perhaps also the fact that the geopolitical situation is getting much worse? That is also part of that conversation. So if you could just comment on that leadership role, perhaps.
I think there absolutely is a leadership role, and that leadership role is based around a clear articulation of the threats that our country faces. And I think too often we think it's inconceivable for threats overseas to affect us here. if we were to tally up the cost of the Russian conflict in Ukraine, what that means for us here, it would be in the billions. Whether that's fuel costs, whether that is oil and gas prices, whether that's the price of food because of the blockage of grain coming out of Ukraine, the economic impact on a global scale is huge. But that debate is often lost back here in the UK. It's a product of being an island nation, and it's a product that actually, and not in the cases also, we have quite a high standard of living. And so I think it's a government's prerogative to highlight and make sure it's a clear understanding of those threats, and then make sure that we, the leadership prioritises those areas that can reduce those threats and increase, hopefully, our economic security over time and therefore our prosperity and all of the services that we can provide the nation.
Thanks. And I'd just like to zoom in now from the sort of grand strategic into the devolved administrations. And one of the things that's actually, I think, struck all of us throughout this inquiry has been, I think you mentioned in your introduction about this sort of postcode lottery of the different geographical application. But there's something specific about the devolved administrations, which is that, lots of government competencies are, healthcare and social care and childcare and so on and so forth. And there's different service provision, actually, in the different nations. And, we've heard of examples where someone starts a course of psychotherapy, for instance, in one, and then moves to, is posted to, a different devolved administration, and that service is not offered in that administration. So perhaps you could comment both on that specific example, whether this new legislation will treat that, but also in a more general sense, how we're going to synergise and synchronise and I guess level up, to use a phrase, between the different devolved administrations and the services that are provided to our service community and our veterans.
I'll maybe take it in reverse. I've visited Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and there absolutely is a difference in the provision of services, not just to veterans but armed forces personnel. People transiting between the two on a 2-year draft, 3-year draft have significant problems. I'm in constant discussion with my devolved counterparts. We try and make sure people are, devolved nations are briefed up on any policies that we're bringing in that may be bounded within England or any one of the devolved nations, so they can track it, understand it and replicate it if they need to. We can't necessarily force them to. And then particularly as we're looking at new proposals as we move forward with support to veterans and the establishment, enablement, communication, education of the Covenant, we're making sure that's being aired really widely with the devolved administration, so hopefully they can integrate into that network and then we can provide a semblance of standardisation. Will we ever get to that panacea? I don't think so.
So what I'd say is, Mr. Barton, in terms of the specific example there, I mean, the whole principle of the Covenant is that the armed forces and their families should not be in a position of disadvantage as a result of their service. So if we've got to recognise that different things are available in different places. So the armed forces can't get something that isn't available where they live because it's available somewhere else. But your specific example was where actually a member of the armed forces was getting something where they had been posted, say medical treatment that was available where they're currently posted, and we post them to somewhere else where that medical treatment may not be openly available. I would see it as a Covenant issue that they are able to continue their treatment in the place that we send them to, even if they couldn't start it.
Is that a commitment under this new legislation? That would be, they would be able to continue that treatment. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And then just a very short one on Northern Ireland. And obviously there are particular obvious issues in Northern Ireland. Many service personnel don't want to advertise their service, for instance. And we have heard that the executive in the Northern Ireland executive doesn't necessarily prioritise the Covenant in the same way. Could you comment on that and whether this new legislation is going to, particularly standardise things in Northern Ireland, or maybe, run us through any conversations you've had with the NI executive on that issue?
Yeah, so I was in Northern Ireland just last week for 2 days, sort of to get a ground feel of some of the issues facing both veterans and those in the armed forces. And obviously there are real nuances to Northern Ireland, particularly around the security threat and those that have served. If I was to be honest, will you ever get a standardisation? I don't think you will, as long as that security threat exists. What I would say from my ministerial responsibility is to ensure we air and shape best practice within Northern Ireland to give the best services for those in the armed forces, those served, and of course their families. Any points on?
Thank you, Mr. So I think just on that one, I think we obviously have to recognise sort of the uniqueness of Northern Ireland, and we have done sort of the Veterans Welfare Service in Northern Ireland, which is an MOD-owned sort of statutory body, offers, for example, certain medical healthcare provision that isn't offered elsewhere in the UK, because elsewhere in the UK it would be offered by the NHS. So it has to be a slightly different approach. But I think sort of more widely into the devolved government space, what we don't want to say is we need to have uniformity. Because that doesn't work in a devolved system. What we want to have is consistency of outcomes. And I think it's the recognising that Wales has Armed Forces liaison officers, which is a network that works fantastically for Wales. It happens slightly differently in different bits of the United Kingdom, and that's absolutely fine, and as it should be, so long as we're taking a Armed Forces centric view of what are the individual needs, and can they be met.
It's worth jumping on that, Mike, to say that we can also learn off the devolved administrations, because the Armed Forces liaison officers in Wales work really well. The Veterans Welfare Service, sort of distributed and regional teams, work really well in Northern Ireland. So what I've done is I've gone around, so we looked at best practice, now we need to pull it back and see if we can provide an element of standardisation here, England, Wales, hopefully Scotland, Northern Ireland. And then on top of that is to ensure we get data as well. There's a lot of support out there. It's our prerogative to ensure that support is focused at the right place at the right time for the right people. But in some cases it's not data driven, and I mean that in particular in the veteran space. We've got to build up our data sets to ensure we know how to help people in the best way.
I was just going to say, and we also hold annual conferences as well with the devolved administrations and the local authorities, which are forums where we can sort of share best practice as well, what we're doing. So, what they're doing in Scotland, for example, could be shared with the rest of the nation as well.
And then final quick bit, is there going to be a covenant team in the MOD that's job is to drive that through?
There already is.
We have their own.
So they absolutely a focus of us. We can make one change, Tan. It's to get this covenant, this legislation through down in 2026. It is not the goal. It will not be the goal, but it's on a stepping stone towards really ensuring that every government department takes the armed forces into consideration when they're pushing policy through, either at the national level or indeed at the local level, which I think is absolutely critical.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I believe Lincoln Job wanted to come in just there as well.
Yeah, just on, because you've made this, the Admiral used the case of medical treatment, but also said, I think, because things are different, we can't level up in the way that Mike's asking. When we visited RAF Lossiemouth, one of the issues meeting the people there was that it was access to free childcare and the different thresholds in age. Now, under anyone else's normal sort of use of the word disadvantage, it would feel to me like I was being disadvantaged if I was getting free childcare at my home station and someone posted me to Lossiemouth and all of a sudden I couldn't. And that sounds like a disadvantage to me, but it sounds like you're steering some sort of course between medical treatment and access to free childcare, in as much as one would be considered a disadvantage, but the other one wouldn't, that would be made good through defence funds. So have I just got the definition right?
Well, I think I'll let Admiral Phil come in a second. On Lossiemouth, I also visited Lossiemouth, although that same issue came up, and then I immediately spoke to my devolved counterpart about that issue to see if they could help resolve it. On the difference between the two, I mean, Phil, if you go.
So I mean, wraparound childcare has been incredibly popular and well received across the Ministry of Defence. It provides armed forces personnel with up to £3,400 per child of childcare in the early mornings and late evenings. It is allowed our people, particularly those who are in dual-serving couples, to manage the pressures of service life with the pressures of family life. Which very often, as you know, I'm quite sure, is one of the key reasons why people leave. So what we're trying to do is to look at how we can expand that further. So the wraparound childcare that we brought out 18 months ago now I think one of the key constraints to that is actually the local provision of access to childcare facilities. So the constraint is not actually anything to do with the scheme itself. Is actually that nationally we need to invest more in childcare facilities so that everybody can participate and make use of them. But going further, we've rolled out just in January this year access to the same level of wraparound childcare which is available in the UK to those who are posted overseas. And actually, I was out in Cyprus just last week, and that's, again, an incredibly valuable benefit and hugely retention positive, which is keeping people in service and keeping people in a position where they can continue to serve the nation. What we're looking to do, obviously, is look at the sort of the variations that exist between different devolved administrations. And all I'd say at the moment is that we're actively looking at how we can understand how we can expand the scheme further in an affordable way. But the really important thing also is we wanted to do it in a way that doesn't create any tax implications for the individuals who are receiving the childcare itself. But it's an area that is constantly under review, and we're looking to make it better.
Good. Thank you. I believe Calvin Bailey wanted to comment on this point.
Okay, directly on that then, Vice Admiral, we may be able to write off the childcare issue and assume that is a policy thing, but you've finished on tax, and actually service in Scotland is the only place in the world where our service personnel suffer a differential rate of tax, which for anywhere else would be considered a SOFA. It's a status of forces agreement. So serve anywhere in the world, all of your wraparound childcare, service, taxation, all of those things are exactly the same except for in Scotland. So how do you get after that?
I think that's something I will need to, and I brought again when I got back from Lossiemouth, I brought this up with my devolved counterpart. We need to really make them recognise the value of defence, the benefits it has, and obviously make sure that we can standardise some of the support mechanisms that we have. I can't promise a short-term fix to that.
And you may be aware that we do provide retrospective financial mitigation to those service personnel who are posted to Scotland, who are based in Scotland, who are therefore, have to pay higher rates of Scottish income tax.
But your premise is absolutely right.
Thank you. Yeah. Ian Rowe?
I'm just going to say, on that point as well, it's not only the service personnel. A point that we picked up on our visit was the spouses and the families who are also disadvantaged. So I know we're talking about compensating serving personnel. Let's not forget about their families and particularly the spouses who have no choice but to accompany their partner to these stations. So I'm thinking we do need to. I don't know if you've got anything. But I was
just going to say, I guess it's always important to consider all the allowances in the whole. I think that's what you were talking about as well. That they, in Scotland they do have different things. So obviously service families resident in Scotland receive free healthcare prescriptions. They receive free dental checkups and free eye examinations. And actually, in terms of childcare, all families, regardless of whether they're working or not, receive 1,140 hours worth of childcare between the ages of 3 and 4, which is different to what we receive in England. So I think it's quite difficult sometimes to compare like for like across the devolved administrations. But as Admiral Phil was saying, we are trying to look at whether there are ways that we can try and sort of standardise things as much as possible, but we just might have to bear in mind the tax implications for that.
I think, Ian, your point about it's not just the serving individual. When the individual's serving, the whole family serves. They get dragged through the same the same rigours as the individual that's serving. So I completely agree.
Good. Right, let's now move on. Move the conversation on to extension of new areas of policy and service delivery. Jesse Norman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Minister, am I right in thinking this is your first evidence session in front of a select committee? Well, may I say what I would say to any member of this committee, which is we thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
And we also thank you for your putting that service, as with members of this committee, to the benefit of this nation. I think it's a profoundly important thing to put in the record. My colleague, the member for Spelthorne to my left, mentioned the legacy issues with veterans. You'll understand that in my part of the world that's a very sensitive issue indeed. Can I take it that you are going to give this your you've looked at this hard, obviously, in the last 8 months. Can I take it that you're going to give this the hardest possible push within government, because it's a very, very serious issue?
100%, 110%. You have my word. I'm going to push this as hard as I can, for the simple reason there's a moral and ethical component of it. There's the fact that if we do not ensure that our armed forces personnel are protected through the system, we can't expect them to join. And I'd argue we also have a broader narrative as well that must be positive and well looked through whole life, from the moment you sign up all the way, and you serve all the way through your life until the day you die. I'm a firm believer of that, whether that's psychological, physical impacts, or indeed just the fact that you'll probably sign back up should there be an issue, and you're on call to do so in some cases anyway. So you have my absolute word.
Thank you very much. One of the effects of the Covenant, as you've described it, is that it's going to be extended into central government departments. Will that include the Treasury?
So I don't want to. At the moment, we're in consultation. I don't want to go into detail. But what I would say is, I always say, go big or go home. So we're going big, and we're going
your ambition, if you like, to put it, to have the Treasury.
We're going really broad.
I mean, I do think that I can say this as a former Treasury Minister. Bringing that particular part of central government into a deeper understanding of what is going on is pretty foundational, not just to the success of the policy, but also obviously to its being effectively funded, which inevitably must be an issue. You will know, in terms of new policy and service delivery, that I'm obsessive about new forms of higher education, this new institute we've got in Herefordshire, very much focused on defence and security. Employment and employment skills, as opposed to education for families and stuff, and transition. Could you just talk a little bit about how you see that from a ministerial standpoint, and whether we can expect change in that area?
Yeah, so just to step back, Defence is one of the best organisations for skills enhancement, and in particular apprenticeships. Our 3 services are in the top 5 nationally, and it's a fantastic catapult for individuals who come in, perhaps maybe not with the best educational qualifications, and can leave with some of the most sophisticated qualifications, whether that be an aircraft engineer, a nuclear engineer, all the way through to teaching skills when they leave. What we've been really clear on, and actually we've had a lot of positivity around, is the new career transition pathway, which takes people, when they leave, all the way through to 2 years post-leave, and ensures that, I always say, we're trained to join the military, we're not trained to be civilians, and so that CTP primarily trains people to reintegrate into civilian life, but also on employment. The statistics on employment straight after service are over 80% of veterans go straight into employment. They're highly employable, they're highly skilled, they bring a whole set and suite of skills which are often not necessarily realised. And I always say that veterans have done 2 amazing things. Number one role of government is to protect the nation, and now they're going to let the economy prosper because they can add real value into any company or enterprise.
I'd very strongly echo that, but I also do think there are cases in which veterans are not able to take the full benefit of their own capabilities developed within the forces, perhaps because they haven't had the kind of academic finishing or the kind of credentials that might allow them to succeed elsewhere. You will know that the government's actually delayed the lifelong learning entitlement. That's quite an important thing, because it would allow veterans to chunk up and take in succession towards the end of their careers, perhaps in the course of their service, a degree, which then means a very much shorter period of requalification or final qualification afterwards. It's something we see in other countries where they do take those kinds of additional skills, Israel would be a classic example, very seriously. And I wonder whether this is something you might be able to pursue with other ministers, because the delay means a disproportionately negative effect in the armed forces, I would suggest.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'll definitely look into it. I think there's two things I would come back before perhaps handing over to the team. The lifelong learning and education people go through, depending on their time in service, is sometimes it's difficult to quantify. a career course or corporal, private to corporal, corporal to sergeant, colour sergeant, warrant officer, and indeed in the officer space as well, accumulates probably to years of leadership, command, team building, training. On top of that, we've got the enhanced learning credits as well. On the specific subject, I'll hand over to Phil or one of the team if we have any detail on it.
I was just going to talk, we have something called the PAN Defence Skills Framework, which we're hoping to sort of roll out later this year, but the idea with that, we're sort of piloting at the moment, is to translate essentially the skills that service personnel are gaining through their service into sort of more recognisable civilian type qualifications, which then they'll be able to use to help them sort of gain employment after they leave as well. So that is something that we are sort of looking at.
I'd be very grateful if you could send me or direct me to something in that area. It'd be very helpful.
Yeah, we can do. And I think the key thing in terms of overall ambition, which is very relevant to the covenant and legislation, is that we want to build more of a skills-based organisation. The armed forces are an ever more skilled business. Digital, cyber, engineering, communications. We need ever more skilled people. And actually, we need the same skills in the industry that's supporting defence and the wider economy, which is generating the prosperity, which in its turn supports defence and the nation as a whole. So what we want to do is, yes, have better recognition of the skills that we give our people so that they can translate into civilian world. But we also want to understand the skills that the people in the civilian world have got so that we can bring them in at an appropriate level, which isn't necessarily the bottom. We can bring them in at the side into key skilled roles. And really importantly, where we can actually move beyond sort of a single-use construct of everyone joins at the bottom and leaves after a few years, to get into zigzag careers where we welcome more and more veterans back into the armed forces, either as reserves or on short-term contracts. And what we intend to do with the Armed Forces Bill is to include legislation which will provide that employment flexibility that breaks down the barriers between regular and reserve service and creates more porosity for people with skills to move in and out of the armed forces into wider industry.
We can expect that in the Armed Forces Bill early next year. Okay. Can we just move on to other areas that you think will be subject to the covenant legal duty, apart from the one we've just touched on?
Again, sorry.
Go.
No, I was just going to say, I think as the Minister said before, we can't sort of talk in any detail at this stage because it's sort of subject to writing around government departments. But I think, as he's also said, we're taking a maximalist approach. So we are engaging, we've engaged with over 150 organisations, including some of the people who've given evidence at this committee already, COBSE, RBL, the families, federations, etc., then to take into account the areas that they think would be helpful in terms of taking into account for the extension of the government duty. But we think there'll be about roughly over sort of 10 new policy areas.
And that's very interesting. And can I just ask, obviously there's always a danger in security defence that people lead with the budget. They don't lead with the need. Can I take it that you guys are focusing on the need and you're going to allow the rest of the issue to, as it were, follow that?
100%. It's got to be sort of effects-based, planning, i.e. what do we want as an outcome, and then work back from it. We've got to accept, though, there will be a balance between some of the geographical requirements, depending where those local authorities are, all the way through to the broader national requirements. Just on your education piece, I launched Op Ascend last 2 weeks ago on Monday, which was really about helping veterans come through that career transition pathway and then get them into employment, but also highly skilled employment. That's already worked really well, and we've got lots of people taking that sort of operation up. So on top of Op Restore, Op Fortitude, and all the other operations that we're running, and we've taken on some of those, we're now building out more.
And not just apprenticeships, if you like, or the equivalent, but genuine, as it were, skills-based higher education.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's very
So it's
helpful.
heading in the right direction. We can provide a briefing on that in due course. And I think, just to elaborate on one more point, is, and I think what Admiral Phil brought out, what we're seeing in Ukraine is a changing character of conflict. I always describe it as a machine gun moment for the Army, a submarine moment for the Navy, and a jet engine moment for the Air Force. That's requiring us. We need different types of people in defence. We need different skills as we move towards a different type of warfare. And that's why I think we've got to really look broader and ensure that if there's any rules and regulations in place that reduce our ability to get the best talent into defence, we start stripping them away. And that's why the Secretary of State has already stripped away 100 different sort of out-of-date medical requirements, a 10-30 rule of giving people offers really early on to get people in. And importantly, Fred will know from some of his APPG work on new technologies and startups, how do we pull them in to points.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Emily Allbutt
Thanks,
wants to come
Chair.
first.
Yeah, just a quick question from me, Minister, in relation to other departments which the Covenant relies heavily on. What representations have you made to DWP on behalf of veterans in relation to the proposed 5 billion cuts and freezes to benefits and PIP?
So we're in discussion with DWP on a regular basis. The consultation on the Covenant in particular has been in circulation now for weeks. We're almost at completion, and we will keep you posted in due course when that comes back.
Have you said anything in particular to DWP about those cuts and about those freezing of benefits?
We've been really clear that nobody in the armed forces or a service in the armed forces should be disadvantaged.
Thank you. Right, let's move on to Lincoln Job, please.
Minister, you mentioned the 10:30 rule. Could you just, I mean, when that was announced, I thought, wow, good luck with that. It's incredibly demanding, but I mean, I genuinely did mean good luck with that, because it'd be fantastic. Could you, it may not be your sort of bag, but could you just give us an update on where we are with the implementation of that?
Yeah, so we've had some, so the 10:30 rule is a provisional offer in 10 and then, turn up on 30 days.
That's days, yeah.
Days, not weeks. And we've already had some people run through that. It's actually very difficult to implement, and we're now trying to shuffle and make sure that the regulations bend to fit that direction. And if there's increased risk or issues, that's to be brought to the minister responsible. It's actually between myself and the minister, the Armed Forces Minister, that own that portfolio. Basically, we need to, the definition of madness is doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. We've got to really look at how we do recruitment differently. We've actually got lots of people interested to join, lots of different skills. It's actually our ability to get them through the door and into the trained ranks, which is proving difficult.
If I can sort of add a bit more to that. I mean, we have looked really hard at all our processes, and one of the key things that we have seen is the fact that actually there are plenty of people who want to join the armed forces. A lot of the people who want to serve, we are not able to provide them with the answers that they wish to hear before they go off and get an offer from someone else. And what it's really, out of every 100 applications for the army, we were getting about 6 soldiers. And most of the fallout in that process happened in the first 8 weeks, where we, frankly, were not being good enough at responding to good people's interest in the armed forces. And they were probably looking at 5 or 6 other employers, and they were snapping up the great candidates quicker than us. So we recognised it was taking about 320 days on average to get people into the armed forces. A lot of that was down to the fact of a heavily paper-driven process. People were having to bring their passport into a careers office for it to be photocopied. When actually, if you get a driving licence, your photograph comes off your passport onto the driving licence. We were not connected in the same way. People were having to put a wet signature on a consent form to go to their doctor, which had to be posted back and forth, sent in the mail to the doctor. The doctor then had to put the medical records in another envelope and send it back. That was taking 49 days for the medical records bit. We're trialling a system now for digital transfer, digital signature, digital transfer. It's taking between 1 and 2 days. That's taken 6 weeks out of the process, just looking at medical. So between eligibility checks for nationality, checks on criminal records, checks on medical health, and checks on educational qualifications, digitisation is taking a lot out of that. A great example of where we're getting it right, and we are already doing, in a small number of areas, the conditional offer. So the single services are all managing to do this for pilot cohorts. One good example is the new cyber pathway that the Secretary of State announced last autumn. The adverts went out for that last month. We'll be sifting through them in April. The first cohort will be joining in the summer just after Easter. The training pathway for those new cyber warriors will be between 4 and 5 weeks, 3 to 5 weeks, instead of 10 to 12 weeks. And by the autumn, they'll be straight into cyber training. So actually, in the time that some people would still be in the application process, those new cyber warriors will be in the trained strength. Now, it is an iterative process, but I think we'll have within a few months, we'll have a clear plan as how we get to that 10 and 30. And a big step in that was obviously the announcement a few weeks ago of us contracting with Serco for the follow-on contract to support the tri-service recruiting model to get rid of the 17 contracts and support contracts we currently have across the 3 services into one tri-service model, which is digitally enabled, which has armed forces people at the front of the office, meeting the candidates and mentoring them through the process, with digital experts in the back offices providing world-class support.
Sitting in those seats last week were defence industry representatives who reminded us that if you sign a contract with SpaceX, it's 6 pages long, and if you sign it with the Ministry of Defence, it's 70.
We are absolutely cognizant of that. We want to cut away the bureaucracy, and I'm sure you'll remember from when you joined, you turned up the armed forces, a couple of pull-ups, slapped on the back, done a medical, and away you went. I'm not saying we need to revert to that, but there is a balance, and we want to.
I signed up when Centurion was a rank, not a tank.
I'm sure the scrutiny was a lot more intense than that for this job. Right, let's move on to now the consistent application of the covenant, and I want to bring in on the private sector first of all, Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, can we talk about the private sector? So we've covered some of the areas of government that Armed Forces Bill may extend the covenant to. But you also have, all of you, mentioned the changing character of warfare and the changing requirement for skills. And you spoke yourself, Admiral, about a kind of porosity, this idea that people can move between private sector and military employment. Currently, my understanding is that if you are a company operating in the UK, you can voluntarily sign the Armed Forces Covenant, you therefore become a signatory, and you qualify to be a bronze, silver or gold employer as part of the Employment Recognition Scheme, the ERS. But all of this is voluntary, and no one is required to do it. We've had, this committee, and also personally I've had, companies who are on the scheme, bronze, silver or gold, who say they don't really know what they're supposed to do. And they're not really sure what the benefit is, aside from some kind of optics. My question to you is this. In the Armed Forces Bill next year, are you going to legislate so that companies have to act differently to how they are acting now, or will it still be voluntary?
So I think we need to be very careful of legislating for every company to act differently. I think that would be a really broad piece of legislation that may have second order implications that we haven't necessarily thought about at the moment. I'm actually a big fan of the Armed Forces Covenant scheme that brings businesses in, and it does create a mutual level of understanding, specifically with the major businesses that we have a regular engagement with, and it does dock them also in not just to armed forces personnel but veterans transition, CTP in particular, career transition pathway, but also the charitable sector, and so it does have a lot of benefits. I think there is a tightening we could do, so I would agree that we could be slightly more demanding of what is required from those individuals that have signed up, but not too much to the point of where they perhaps wouldn't want to sign up.
And we do have a defence relationship management team who are in place, who do that sort of account management with those private sector organisations. And I think it's very clear in terms of the sort of levels you talked about, bronze, silver and gold. You know, bronze is really for those organisations who make that commitment and who have, you know, pledged to the covenant. The silver is more about making an actual real change in their organisation, and then the sort of gold standard is about acting as a real advocate amongst other organisations as well. And so I think there is more that we could do with that, but there is I think there is work that is being done anyway by that team to sort of engage on a regular basis. And again, we're not sort of policing what these organisations are doing, but to sort of check in and obviously make sure that they are adhering to the principles of the covenant, and absolutely making sure that, you know, if they're not adhering, that, you know, we obviously need to address that. And we get a lot of feedback, I would say, from the charity sector as well. They are very good at letting us know when things aren't running as they think it should.
Okay, thank you. The committee have come back recently from a trip to Finland and Estonia, societies where there is a whole of society defence culture, which permeates from the public sector, government, well into the private sector, which does not happen in this country. Minister, you've made comments previously that we might need to adopt something along these lines. Personally, my belief is we have to, and that looks like a bigger reservist force. That means that the requirement for companies, often who have to act in their own interest, right? They've got shareholders or they've got different strategies behind them, they have to go and try and make money. And yet we as a country are going to need these companies to let us have their skilled employees, like you mentioned before, the changing character of conflict. It's going to require those skills. We need them. Thinking theoretically, what are some things that the government could ask companies to do in years to come, specifically to increase the fighting capability of our forces? Aside from asking them to offer better employment schemes for veterans, but specifically to help our fighting force, what are some things we could do and require of the private sector?
Yeah, so I think just to take the question back a bit, so Finland and Sweden obviously weren't in NATO till relatively recently, and therefore had to rely on themselves for defence, primarily against the threats they faced. Nevertheless, their whole society approach is definitely worth reading and looking at. It is on a different scale. I would also absolutely agree with you that we require defence in depth, and that defence in depth means our ability to mobilise the nation if we required mass for a sustained or prolonged conflict. Our adversaries, whichever way you look, are designed to fight an attritional conflict, and attrition can be decisive. And therefore we need to think about what it would be like to be caught in a longer conflict that wasn't necessarily over in a short period of time, with a high attrition rate, both in people and material. And that's where I think industry really comes into it, because within that defence in depth model, you have your regular force, you have your reserve force, you then have a strategic reserve. That strategic reserve is in excess of 400,000 people, veterans that have left that are under 55. A lot of those individuals work in the defence sector you're talking about. And what we need to be careful of is if you mobilise that strategic reserve, that you rip the heart out of the defence sector. But actually, there's a commonality between the two, and you see this in Ukraine, where those reservists with the skills and the understanding from the industrial base dock in, they bring the industrial knowledge with them, and as they have this symbiosis where they pull the two together. And so you end up in an innovation cycle that is faster than ever before. But it's taken a conflict and a crisis to make that happen. I'm not going to prejudge what's going to come out in the Strategic Defence Review, but I would argue that industry and innovation will be a critical component of it.
I think building on specifically the point around what some of our asks of private industry may be. So currently, to get the Gold Award, you have to have signed up to giving your reservists 2 weeks additional paid leave a year to fulfil their reservist duties. And whilst, as you've rightly said, these are voluntary pledges, they are public pledges. You can go and you can look up which companies have said that they will do what under the terms of the covenant. And therefore there are mechanisms where we do get phone calls from individual X saying, I work for company Y and they're a gold scheme holder, but I've just been told that I can't go and do my reservist training. And we can have we can pick up the phone and have a quiet conversation, and that does happen. So I know that so the minister is keen to say, look, can we put a bit more teeth to that? And that is something that we will keep under review. But certainly at the moment, the standard for gold and the standard for silver is sort of that active support and active advocacy for members of the armed forces community working within those organisations.
Just from a tactical point of view as well, I mean, lots of private sectors are already doing some brilliant work in things like, supporting, like mobile phone providers, have committed to removing disadvantage to the armed forces community by allowing suspension of UK mobile contracts when armed forces personnel are moved overseas, for example. And the same with, some of the UK's largest banks who are signatories, HSBC, Nationwide, etc. And they've committed to allowing armed forces personnel to rent out their homes without facing higher mortgage costs or having to change their mortgage when posted overseas. So those are some of the things, obviously, that they're also doing to support armed forces personnel at the more tactical level.
Thank you. It's not my portfolio, but I would argue from a private sector we need to see a far closer relationship between defence and the smaller startup companies and subject matter experts who sometimes have the best innovative ideas. And there's some great examples in the US of Softworks and other places where they actually use defence as an incubator or indeed a trials and development system to enhance what I would call critical national technologies that sit in the UK, those technologies that are critical to our national defence.
Thank you. I just want to explore that further because the submission that we received from British Veteran Owned, now, according to them, those businesses who often sign the covenant without meaningful follow-through, thereby they completely reduce its credibility because there's a lack of accountability. And also, according to another submission that we received, it was the fact that companies with various bronze, silver or gold do not appear to always abide by its principles. So what is the MOD going to do to hold people to account?
I think it's a really good point, and I go back to Lincoln's point about the bureaucracy and the processes and the way. I'll take that point on board, and we'll go back and review to make sure that both gold, silver and bronze are held to account to abide by those principles. And indeed, if we need to add a bit more teeth, then we'll absolutely do that.
I agree. I mean, we definitely can't have people signing up to something and then benefiting from having that accreditation and using the logo, etc., and then not having any knowledge of those principles or not acting on it, because I think then they're failing not only our veterans but they're failing the country as well. So I hope that ministers will take that evidence into account. Right, let's move on to regional variations now. Ian Room, please.
Right. Thank you, Minister, for your attendance today and your service, and obviously indeed all the panel for the work that you do to support our service personnel and veterans. I want to get into the inconsistency around the covenant and how it's applied. So basically, we received submissions from local authorities, one that went really top to bottom and thought the duty out through and through and are applying it consistently. Whereas other local authorities have said to us, actually, in the absence of any particular funding to support the covenant, we are doing the absolute minimum. So will the new legislation include measures to ensure better and more consistent application to the covenant?
So I just, one, I will absolutely agree with what you've just said. I visited probably in excess of 10 local authorities. I've briefed and spoke to 30 of them at the recent covenant, well not recent, a couple of months ago, sort of covenant meeting that we had. And I do think it is absolutely dependent on the council of how they implement the covenant. I also think there is a requirement on the Ministry of Defence to educate people on the covenant at the local level so they are better informed as to what the covenant stands for and the principles of which they need to follow. A council turning around or a local authority saying we're doing the absolute minimum, I think is completely and utterly unacceptable, because they misinterpret the requirement and the acknowledgement that the armed forces protect us all. And so, to say they're doing the absolute minimum, I think is atrocious. But on the same hand, I've also gone to other councils who are doing an amazing job and have properly implemented the council across the country, northeast to southwest. I mean,
you absolutely do get those councils who do the bare minimum. What we also find is there are those councils who have got a whole raft of other pressures and priorities, and come to us and say, well, it's not that we don't want to help, it's that we don't understand. And we have worked sort of over the years to do toolkits and training material, the Our Community, Our Covenant report, which in it sort of contains, look, these are the sorts of things as a local authority you can do, and by the way, here are some pots of money that you can apply for. And there'll be some more work sort of coming out in the next few months, which looks at takes case studies of different local authorities and different local authority groupings across the UK and the different ways in which they're implementing the covenant. And again, it comes back to the sort of the consistency of outcomes point rather than the uniformity of approach. And it's there are a number of ways in which you can set it up depending on what your local demographics are. But certainly for us, we find that if you can say, look, this is what good looks like, more often than not, we get the traction, and that's despite the other pressures that those local authorities are under.
I mean, they will have to have considered the principles.
Yeah,
I mean, as we broaden it out, those different bits of those local council will have to consider the principles, in particular with veterans and armed forces personnel. If they haven't considered them, then they're in breach of the duty.
So, following on from that, some of the evidence that we've received as a committee criticises the language of due regard. For example, Air Vice Marshal David McLaughlin stated that the legal duty of due regard was weak and could easily be ignored, explaining that at the most flippant end he had been told that due regard means that given the issue a short period of thought, and the answer would have been no to a request because they'd have just considered it. And actually, do we feel, or do you feel, that that due regard needs to be a strong? There should be a stronger definition of due regard and what it means for authorities to look at it.
I think we've got to consider this in the broader spectrum, and take housing, for example, which is a continual issue that we deal with, and we try and make sure that both armed forces personnel have housing, families and single living accommodation all the way through to veterans. There's a huge housing shortage in the UK, and everyone around this table will have had multiple people come to them about a lack of council housing. If a veteran also comes to you with a lack of housing, that due regard will ensure that local council must consider it. But there may be a higher priority than that individual. It could be a single mum with children, it could be a family in desperate need. And so what I would say is we've got to be very careful of imposing rules and regulations that disadvantage others, but making sure that the right parts of both local authorities and the government level consider this in detail before they go through with any policy changes. Okay. And I think we're on a journey. And I think this is, because we're going really broad, is a step in the right direction. Is it a reflection of the end state of where we want to be? Probably not, but I think it will get better over time.
I was just going to, and I guess we've made it that way to ensure that it is deliberately flexible, and we're not sort of trying to police it as such. And we see it as an actual positive that we're putting it in this way, and we kind of see it as drawing parallels with the public sector equality duty, which in the same way organisations have to have due regard to that. So we think you could bring it in and look at it in the same way as that. I would just say on your previous point as well about local authorities and the sort of standardisation, again, MOD is a co-chair of something called the Covenant Community Action Group, and again that's a forum where you bring together all of the local authorities and you can share best practice, so it is an opportunity for people to kind of learn and understand how they should be applying the Armed Forces Covenant.
I mean, I have been part of a local authority and I have been a leader of a local authority, and may I just say that the actual meaning of what it means, it's very good to say we signed the Armed Forces Covenant, but putting into an action is a different thing, and that's why I'm saying, is it inconsistent using the word due regard when it's saying, well, you show us on the metrics what you've done to actually ensure that you've taken this as due regard. Coming back to another one, we've received lots of admissions, Mr. Chair, and around actual serving personnel not understanding or even knowing that there is a covenant. And it was the statistic, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me what the statistic is because it was a survey that was done, it was very low. And I was wondering what you are doing to ensure that our service personnel actually know that there's a covenant there that can help them and their families. And I know we've got charities again which we're relying on to do this, but what is the actual Ministry of Defence doing to ensure service personnel know that the Armed Forces Covenant exists?
Yeah, so can I just, two things I'd say on your previous comment about metrics across the councils. There's no way in which we capture the data at the moment. Like, there's no generic standardised way we capture data. So when you turn around and go, right, which councils are doing what, it's actually very difficult for us to go good, the bad and the ugly. And so we've got to improve our data capture, not just on veterans, but across the whole armed forces community when it comes to local authority and delivery of the covenant. So we absolutely recognise we've got to move on that. We've got a couple of plans moving forward on it. And the second bit I would say is reference individuals in the armed forces understanding. I think over half, 54% of personnel reported as knowing at least a little bit about the covenant as a whole. So we need to work harder to make sure they're educated on what the covenant is, and in particular what it isn't, because there's a lot of misperception out there as to what it isn't, and then we find ourselves dealing with lots of complaints when in reality sometimes it's just through to a lack of misunderstanding. So that's on us to educate our personnel better, but also we've got to work on a mechanism how we educate local authorities more effectively.
Thank you, Minister. And I think it's a really valid point because, I've certainly had conversations where, I've had people say to me, the covenant, that's just a veteran thing, isn't it? And it's like, no, it's a whole of the armed forces community thing. And I think part of what the new legislation will do, I think for the serving community, it's, okay, what's in it for us? And I think when we can point to specific things, if we can point to Forces Help to Buy, all the way through to having your car insurance and your mobile phone bill paused when you deploy on ops, and say, look, this is all part of the no disadvantage package of measures. Then you sort of see the lights go on and it sparks. And I think that some of the measures, certainly in the education and the sort of serving family healthcare space, that we hope the legislation will give us some stronger levers on, as well as things like spousal employment and partner employment, will make it feel more relevant and more pertinent for the serving community.
I served for 24 years and I don't think I'd heard about it until the last 2 years of service.
But just to say that officials are working to look about how the best way to communicate with our armed forces personnel, looking at a specific sort of comms plan and training on sort of on the covenant as well. We've recently launched a families hub as well for all for the armed forces community as a whole, and it has links in there specifically to the armed forces covenant, as well as all the benefits and other kind of useful links in terms of education and childcare and healthcare, etc. So that's had some good feedback so far.
Just to finish off on this section, Minister, I've heard you say that, particularly towards veterans, ensure that you tell your GP that you are a veteran. And could you just explain to the committee what advantages it would be to that veteran telling their GP that they have served or in the forces?
There's a legal duty of where they've got to consider that. I find a lot of the cases across the veteran space is there is a plethora of help out there, but it's very difficult to find which bit of help is suitable for you in the right space at the right time. And so I'm really clear that if you make an active approach to sort of look into the system, there's often help everywhere, but it's just difficult to get hold of it. It's on us. I go back to the numbers of the Canadian system to our system. It's on us to put in place a structure that makes that easier for veterans. On the doctor's case in particular, I find that sometimes veterans don't want to shout about being veteran. I mean, we talked about Northern Ireland. That's an obvious one, but also in the UK, there's a thing of where you don't really want to perhaps champion it. And I always encourage veterans to make sure you mention it, because there are actually quite a lot of benefits out there. It's not perfect, but there are a lot of benefits out there.
And there's two specific initiatives we might raise as well, which is for veterans to raise if they have sort of mental health problems. There's something called Op Courage, which has seen about 35,000 referrals since it's been going, been very successful. And then Op Restore as well is about if they need help with sort of physical health, and this just puts them in touch with sort of the various pathways and are managed by various of the sort of charity sector. To try and provide them the support and care, whether it's clinical or not, that they need. And that Op Restore's had about over 1,000 veterans so far since it was launched.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Minister. Hello, panel. I'd like us to come on and think about your thinking regarding how the Covenant can become more inclusive for parts of our armed forces community who sometimes receive less focus. As the Minister will know, my constituency is home to the largest population of both serving and veteran Gurkhas in the UK, and we also have other serving and veteran personnel with non-UK nationality. So our non-UK nationality personnel put up with a lot. They serve our country and make a huge contribution, yet there are barriers to their career progression. We don't give them full citizenship as they do in the US. We charge them for their visas to bring their family to the UK. We charge them when their family applies for indefinite leave to remain. These issues affect 1 in 20 of all of our personnel and 15% of partners of serving personnel. Is this legislation an opportunity to show our non-UK nationality personnel our full respect and sort out some of these issues?
So, first of all, I'd just say our non-UK personnel, whether they be Gurkhas or otherwise, provide an absolute sterling part of our armed forces. And I've served with the Gurkhas and others all over the world, and they deserve our utmost respect. From a Gurkha perspective, which I know is linked to your constituency, I'm meeting the ambassador to Nepal next week. We're going to discuss some of these issues. We have about 18,000 Gurkha veterans in the UK, and of course we've got the Gurkha Welfare Advice Centre and the Trust Fund as well, which is moving in the right direction. We're absolutely committed as a government to scrapping non-UK veterans' visa fees who've served the country for 4 years or more, so we're absolutely on that, and we're in discussions at the moment with the Home Office that will hopefully move forward in due course. And then for the specifics, I'll hand over to the broader team.
Thank you, Minister. I think where we have moved, been able to move forward, and I think it's it's important to understand what are sort of legacy issues and what are current issues. They are both equally important, but our levers for dealing with them are different. As the Minister has alluded to, currently the rule is if you've served for 6 years, then your visa fees are waived. This government has made a commitment to reduce that to 4 and to include dependents in that. I think there are also some more within defence things that are within our gift to do. For example, previously we've always had a rule that if you're a serving person and you're deployed overseas and a close family member gets taken seriously ill, our Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre will get you home. But the policy said get you back to the UK. Which obviously if your close family member is in Ghana or Fiji, that's not much good. So we've changed that policy. And we are looking at sort of a raft of other similar ones where, frankly, just through a lack of thought, the policies didn't take some of this into account. And where we are identifying those are being changed. But also, as the Minister has said, I think part of the challenge is that the immigration process is complicated, and therefore making sure that we've got the support at sort of unit level and at service level to help navigate our people through the application process is really important, as well as being open with them up front as to the hoops that will need to be jumped through.
So, I mean, in terms of this legislation, you can say today that you will be thinking in that broadest terms in terms of this community when that legislation comes forward.
I think those individuals that have served our country absolutely deserve our support. So absolutely supportive. I think there is a bit within defence that as individuals either come to the end of their tenure, to make sure that they understand what they need to do when, to ensure they're prepared for when they leave. And we'll make sure that's included within the career transition pathway. Obviously it won't fit all, because some people perhaps want to return to the country of origin, some people want to stay. So that needs to be balanced, needs to be an individual choice, but we'll absolutely help them with that process.
So I also just want to touch on another part of our community that I think it's really important are recognised in all of this. So bereaved families. How is the Covenant going to be there for our families who have paid the ultimate sacrifice?
I've been on operations where people have died and left family and children behind. I don't think in any way, shape or form, from my perspective, that we can do enough to support them. They are front and centre of this. I've met with the bereaved charities, which is over 9 different charities that come together and talk about what we can do and what more we can do for bereaved families, whether that be the scholarship scheme for bereaved children, all the way through to ensuring that bereaved loved ones have the support required. So you absolutely have my word that they will be included within this, and they are a critical component of the armed forces community while loved ones are serving, or where perhaps they've passed away, and afterwards they are still members of that community, forevermore. Any more from...
So I think we've talked a bit about the principle of due regard, which applies to the vast majority of the service community, but there's also the principle of special consideration. And special consideration is what applies to those members of the community who have gone above and beyond and have committed, made the ultimate sacrifice, bereaved members of our community, members of the community who have had life-changing injuries. And for those people, that is where actually simply making sure they are not disadvantaged is not good enough. For those who are bereaved or with life-changing injuries, that is where we have to go further to make sure that the nation recognises the sacrifices that they have made and that we take particular care of them.
I was at a meeting of the Defence Bereaved Families Group just last week. One of the things that really struck home with me is bereavement hits everybody differently. And one of the things that we've just reissued and relaunched is our Purple Pack, which is the guidance that sort of a visiting officer sort of takes with them when they go to do that dreaded knock on the door, and that in that sets out sort of the full range of support that is available, both through defence, through wider government, and the third sector. And it's something that sort of the visiting officer can use as a handrail to talk that individual and their family through what is sort of the hardest of times.
Thank you very much, Emily. What, please?
Thanks, Chair. As you'll know, veterans often come up in our evidence as a group who feel that they aren't as supported by the Covenant as well as others. And I want to thank you, Minister, so far for your engagement with myself and the nuclear veterans. But as you'll know, an internal investigation was launched last November. The Secretary of State assured me and this committee that nothing at all was being withheld. Yet the Daily Mirror have just reported that at least 250 files referencing blood tests hadn't been disclosed to ministers or in FOI requests due to a filing error. Were you aware of this?
I just want to be really clear on nuclear test veterans, and I've been really honest and open on everything we're doing. Bit part reviews that look at a section of a section of a section within a single service as part of a broader defence community is not the way to get the broadest and most honest view of what files weren't kept within the nuclear test veterans community. So I've been really clear throughout to everybody within the nuclear test veteran space that we are doing a comprehensive review of all of the files. And I think a lot of people have said things in the past without doing that larger review. It would be remiss of me to say I have seen, haven't seen, have looked at a section until that is done. And I'm meeting nuclear test veterans, I think perhaps with yourself at the end of the month again, to make sure the dialogue is continues and they're really clear. But until that whole review is done, and it is comprehensive. I mean, we're an analogue department, so you've got 70, 80 years of files, about yellow pages thick, in hangars all over the UK. So we need to do this comprehensively, and I won't be drawn into comment on it until we've done that comprehensive summary. And I can look you in the eye, comprehensively say yes, no, or indifferent. I think it's really important.
You know when it'll be concluded, Minister?
No. So the scale of the issue is gargantuan. Looking through those filing systems, and we'll give you an update at the end of the month when we're sat down with the nuclear test veterans.
You know as well as I do, they're dying. And their families are desperate for them to get some justice. And I suppose the issue here is that new files are being uncovered because of admin errors. And, there's a history in this country, isn't there, of big scandals where things have perhaps been not shared with ministers or secretaries of state. The infected blood scandal, previous Secretary of State said that information was withheld from them by officials. So I suppose what I'm trying to drive at is how sure and confident are you that all the information you need in this review is actually available and is there and is being shared fully with yourself and the Secretary of State?
So a ministerial role is a leadership role, and I won't blame officials or the department. It's my job if they fail me, I haven't asked the right question or sought the right demands. So I'm being really clear with them. I want a comprehensive view of all of the files, and I want to be able to, again, look Parliament in the House at Defence Rules or wherever else at one of these committees and say I have looked through it thoroughly, and yes, no, or indifferent, because until then I'll be giving you a view of a snippet of, looking through a straw pipe rather than having a broader view of the whole system.
Just two more quick questions. Have you been to AWE to view the files yourself, as the previous minister did?
I definitely haven't been to AWE yet. For me to micromanage and jump right into the middle of a big review may skew the whole system and detract them from their broader and far more important objective of looking holistically across the whole filing system. I will delve into the detail when I think I need to.
And will you declassify Merlin or not?
So I will not comment on the filing system at the moment. What I will say is we'll meet at the end of the month. We'll discuss this with NTVs. I'll give you an update where we are. We'll be completely open and honest. The only thing I can say that would ever get in the way of this is not a conspiracy theory, nefariousness. It's usually bureaucracy and poor data management, whether that's analogue or indeed digital. But we will get to the bottom of it.
And that's been the root of previous scandals. It hasn't been deliberate. It's been that, and I'm just concerned that this may be going the same way, Minister. But I'll leave it there till our next meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. Obviously, Minister, the issue of nuclear test veterans has been raised in previous evidence sessions, including with the Secretary of State, who did intimate that he will make sure that all the records are gone through and that there's nothing in secret. But the recent article in the Mirror by Susie Boniface actually showed that, allegedly, that secret records about experiments on troops were hidden from ministers and from Parliament. So no doubt the committee may well be coming back to this, but we will await your findings on that. And just before I move on, I just wanted to get something on the record in terms of excessive fees. Now, you intimated that you will rightly be reducing for non-UK nationals the visa requirements to 4 years. Now, the Royal British Legion, in their submission to our committee, they said that the indefinite leave to remain visa fees should be removed from personnel from non-UK backgrounds and their families. Is that what you have committed to today, or just want to get that clarity?
So this government is committed to scrapping visa fees for non-UK veterans who've served our country for 4 or more years and their dependents. Right. That's for the record.
Just okay, so not fully with what they'd wanted, but just wanted to now move on to data collection and evaluation. Lincoln Jopp, please.
Go big or go home. Fantastic. Lovely intent. Wouldn't it be fantastic if you just leave it at that? Unfortunately, as you and I know, what gets measured gets resourced. And there is a really knotty problem as you roll this out to other government departments as to how you agree those measures of effectiveness. Now, you know the problems. So to come back to your effects-based planning, you kind of know the problems. So the eradication of those problems is kind of the outcome that you want. But to what extent are you able, with other government departments, to design the socket into which they plug? Or are they being allowed to say, my return says I did not knowingly disadvantage any member of the forces community as a result of the actions of the DWP, for example?
I think, so at the moment, the structure that we have to enforce the covenant and therefore measure the effectiveness at the grassroots level, the charitable level, the local level, and then the national level doesn't exist. That's the reality. We don't have a methodology. We don't have the sockets. We don't have the network. We don't have the synapses. We don't have. There is nothing in place at the moment. What I would argue, as we move forward, we need to work out what that structure looks like to ensure that, one, we can get the grassroots feel from those individuals, either in the Armed Forces. The Armed Forces Commissioner will play a bit of that, but a network that delivers that for the Armed Forces serving personnel, that delivers it for the veterans as well, that can help pool data from the charitable sector, who has a large chunk of it, but it's often in silos and not necessarily the most comprehensive or collaborative, that can then be articulated and then analysed to work out whether we are delivering on the covenant as a whole. So we have plans afoot. They will come out in due course.
Because I think when this legislation comes to the House, people are going to want to know that it's not just performance art. It is actually going to have an effect. And those measures of effectiveness are clearly crucial.
I completely agree with you. And I think there's a requirement for the ability to analyse that data, but also to ensure we have something monitoring the support mechanisms right down at the local level. But also from an education communication pathway for all of those local authorities that perhaps don't see the covenant as a priority and haven't been educated in it. So how do we have that network? Where does it feed into? And then where does, once analysed, that data should then come up to us at the ministerial level in the Office for Veterans Affairs to ensure we can then hold other government departments to account if we don't think they're delivering, or indeed spread best practice if it's working really well.
And two other areas I'd say that we are developing statutory guidance again for these new organisations to abide by, and there'll be templates by which they can they should be recording their decisions and their actions that they're taking with due regard, when they're making policy decisions about that kind of thing. So we can look to that as to how we assess how that's going. The Covenant annual report is another way in which we can potentially use that going forwards as a potential measurement or evaluation about things have been working in terms of policy changes that other government departments or the devolved administrations have been doing. And I know that was one area that the charitable sector we've been speaking to them about whether we use the report in that way in future.
It's interesting, if I may, we have some amazing people out there in the local councils already, and you'll know some of them from your own constituencies, armed forces champions, veterans champions, some paid, some not, some on top of a job, some full-time employment. There is a requirement, as we talked before, about standardisation, of standardising some of that support. And interestingly, if you were to speak to them in your constituency, say, hey, when you get the insight and understanding from the grassroots level, where does your data go? Well, it doesn't. It sits there at the council level. And so that is a great network of understanding that already exists, but we need to make a pipeline to ensure their data can come up and be analysed correctly. So it's a systems approach we need to take to this. And we've got best practice from some other countries that we need to mould together and do what's right for the UK.
A huge piece of work to accompany the bill. If any government department or local authorities don't get the point, then limited conscription would be perfect. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Did you want to come in on this, or shall no problems? Okay, well, look, I just want to go on to now annual reporting. So some of our evidence says that the annual reporting mechanisms gives a very limited picture of the covenant's impact. Basically, it's more focused on actions rather than outcomes, and that was more and more apparent to us from various submissions. So how could the annual reporting process be improved?
In some cases, there are lots of different annual reports and statistics that come up, which individually are important, but collectively I think are really significant. And when you pull those together, you get quite a good feel for it. But I don't think it replicates or represents, in some cases, what's happening at the grassroots level. And that's why I go back to the point I just made about individuals that are dealing with veterans and armed forces communities in the charitable sector. They often have the best feel and understanding of what is working, what isn't. What we need to make sure is the correct pipeline up and through to air those issues and ensure that we can support them in the most effective manner. Do you have any?
I think the other thing to think about here is the role of the Armed Forces Commissioner. And I think the Armed Forces Commissioner, being an independent voice for the armed forces and their families, and providing that means to raise to the surface before Parliament issues that are affecting service personnel, affecting their families, and possibly preventing them seeing a long-term future for themselves, long-term career in service of the nation. These are the issues which I think Parliament will probably be exposed to more readily and have the opportunity to delve into more deeply should you wish.
Okay, well, COBSEO in their submission, and I think it was Lieutenant General Sir Nick Pope who intimated that basically the reporting is less good at recognising what is actually happening within wider society. So it's very good at this is what the state is doing, so that's great, but not so good what is happening around us. And then the Joining Forces group, they also said that in terms of the social impact of the covenant, that needs to be evidence as well. So, in your view, what evidence should the annual report be looking to capture to show whether the covenant is performing well?
I actually think from a covenant performance perspective, it's going to be very difficult to capture that data through that reporting mechanism. Because, as I've just described, there is no structure in place to pull it up and through from what really are the deliveries of the covenant, which is your local authorities, which are going to deal with either the armed forces, individuals at the grassroots level, all the way through to veterans and their families. And so I think we've got to carefully look at how we pull that data and then analyse it in future to make sure we're making the right decisions on what outcomes work and what don't. COBCO is a really interesting setup that provides a very good and interesting insight into the third sector, which is also useful. And I think other surveys such as AFCAS, etc., whilst maybe not focused at the covenant, do provide us an insight as to how our armed forces personnel are or see the delivery of services and support. I think if I was to baseline before handing over, is that we've got to restructure how we look at pooling the data up from what is a really broad spectrum of outputs that are going to enhance in 2026 onwards to ensure that the right bits of our local and national architecture are delivering the right support to our serving our veterans and our armed forces families.
Vice Admiral?
If I may, Chair. So I think this is something that the team and I are looking at actively. We know that the Covenant annual report will need to change going forward because it was established before we had the current duty extension. It's far less the one that we are now bringing in. And if you look at the back of the Covenant annual report, there are actually some quite useful metrics in there around service children, educational attainment levels compared to non-service children, around waiting times for cancer treatments, around access to social housing. So I think there are some things there that we can look at and say, okay, given where we are wanting to take the new legislation and the duty extension, what does that mean some of the output and outcome measures are that we want to be looking at in the future should be? But I really do agree with the Minister that this will not be straightforward. This will take some while to bed in, but it's absolutely on our radar, and we're starting those conversations now.
Right, okay. Well, Minister, you'll be aware that our Defence Committee has held annual evidence sessions with an MOD Minister reviewing how well the Armed Forces Covenant is working. So, first of all, would you commit to appearing before us going forward on that annual basis, just to look at what is happening with the Armed Forces Covenant?
100%.
Great. Well, I just wanted to first of all clarify that. And also, going forward, how do you see parliamentary scrutiny of the Covenant working? Because if the legal duty is actually extended across government, while it's always a pleasure to have an MOD Minister in front of us, if that's to extend across a range of government departments, how do you envisage the parliamentary scrutiny to be taking place?
I think it's a really important subject. The reality is we can set the parameters and set the principles with the Covenant, but the other government departments will need to make sure they're implemented. So I would argue that if you were to move forward on a Covenant that is cross-government, it would be useful to ask them, in particular the other government departments, how they are implementing the Covenant, because they will have a far better detailed knowledge, and it would be good to hold in some cases to account, and there's some fantastic examples of where they do an amazing job, and it would be good for them to champion it.
Okay. And what information about other departments' performance will be made available to assist public and parliamentary scrutiny?
So we will try our best to make sure as much information is available as possible and is open source. But I go back to my original comment that the structures in place to provide a detailed analysis of what is good, what is bad, and what isn't working doesn't necessarily exist at the moment. So we are starting from scratch, especially as we broaden out the covenant to include such a broad amount of government departments. We need to put in place this structure that, one, make sure people deliver service, and two, make sure we have proper analysis of what's working, what isn't. Until that happens, we're going to have to continue to iteratively build our feedback chains up.
Good. Right, just before we conclude, Mr. Greenrod, I wanted to come back to something that you referred to earlier in terms of the work of the local government. Now, we already know that the local government, they are significantly overstretched in terms of the provision of public services given their resources. So if we are looking to extend the covenant duty, that while the LGA in their submission said that yes, that's great, we are more than happy with that, but how are we going to ensure that there's appropriate funding? How is there appropriate resourcing so that they can actually undertake that extra task? What do you think?
Unfortunately, I can't offer a blank cheque, Chair, but there genuinely is sort of all sorts of good examples of where either local authorities are recognising that actually it's a self-sustaining model to be supporting their armed forces community, or they're pooling resources together. As the Minister has also alluded to, is this somebody doing it on top of their day job? And whilst for some of us that might feel, no, that shouldn't be the case. I think, again, depending on the size and scale of the armed forces demographic in any sort of local area, it doesn't necessarily need to be a large sort of number of individuals who are focused on this. So I think what we're looking to do and looking to get out as part of sort of a raft of statutory guidance and wider guidance surrounding the extension is some case studies of how different local authorities and different local authority groupings are able to actually be best practice in terms of delivering the covenant, and really looking to build on the positives and having the conversation around this is what good looks like.
Good. Well, Minister, I hope that you're having these conversations with the local government minister, because what we should not be walking into is a situation whereby the duties and the extra responsibilities are not clearly defined, and if they're not well supported and co-developed, are those discussions already happening?
They are, and I think the key word there is co-developed. They need to be done in conjunction with the other government departments, so they understand how to implement them and the costs associated with them. I think this was really easy when there's a national threat and everybody understands the relevance and the utility of the armed forces, or indeed where lots of people have served. Sometimes we don't necessarily explain or articulate the threat properly, and we don't have that many people that have served in society anymore, so we've got that drift. The covenant will bring this back together and start sewing society and defence closer together over time.
And just to reassure on that as well, as part of our sort of engagement with other government departments, including MHCLG, we are conducting a new burdens assessment as well, so we will take that into account.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. And my final point would be on evidence that we received from Lieutenant General Cedric Pope, which was that around expanding the covenant, as you're looking to do that with the Armed Forces Bill and the legislation moving forward, was the fact that if we end up just making everything a priority, nothing becomes a priority. So we don't want to, I think that there's a considerable concern within the defence community about losing focus. So how can we make sure that this is not a shallow process going forward, that we do actually still remain deep focus on serving our brave servicemen and women and the veterans? How will you ensure that within the upcoming legislation?
Well, I think there's two things to one. One, I would argue, whilst we've got to maintain focus, it was too narrow in the past. And as a result, a lot of various different other government departments necessarily needed to support. That will be broadened out. And secondly, I think if we're going to ensure that, we need to have a mechanism, a structure in place that ensures people deliver in line with the principles of that covenant. Without that, we won't be able to hold people to account.
Thank you very much. Well, Minister, it has been a pleasure to be taking part in this hearing, and I thank you very, very much for your time. I think in terms of the Armed Forces Covenant inquiry, I think that this evidence session has proved very, very productive. Before we wrap up the hearing, I'd like to thank Mr. Carns, your good self, as well as Vice Admiral Haley, as well as Ms. Houghton and Mr. Greenrod. Thank you for appearing before the committee. Order, order.